So what happened? So why? Because LIBOR is something which has been around for decades. So what suddenly happened that there was this sudden need for transition? So the use of LIBOR was actually called into question following the global financial crisis. During the global financial crisis, it was found out that there are certain firms or certain panel banks, so to say, who were misstating their LIBOR submissions. By misstating, there were two or three things that were happening in the background. They were sometimes colluding with other banks to improve their rates, and there was a discussion happening behind the estimates that were being submitted by them. There was this discussion was generally to avoid a perception of financial weakness, so there was that happening as well. The second thing that was happening was that the rates that were being submitted, they did not generally represent the rate at which those panel banks were actually executing their transactions. So they did not represent the rate at which the banks were actually borrowing and lending money. So if you look in the middle of the slide on the second bullet, you would see that for a typical day, any one particular day where those 35 LIBORs are being calculated, the estimated number of market transactions that are underpinning LIBOR are for the smaller tenures of 1 month and 3 months. There were only 6 to 7 actual market transactions across all panel banks. So remember, these are 8 to 11 panel banks, but there are actually only 6 or 7 transactions that are happening across those two tenors on a daily basis. It's even lower for the longer tenors. So for the 6 month tenor, it was actually only 2 to 3 market transactions per day. And for the 1 year tenor, it was just barely one market transaction per day, or maybe not even one. So what was actually happening was, initially what was estimated to be an linking to the actual reality, where it was estimated that these banks would give numbers which were actually backed by actual transactions. Most of the panelist submissions was only being based on judgments. So these judgments used to be the judgments of the people in these banks who were responsible for submitting these rates. So it was not really benchmarked on anything robust or reliable. So it was more based on all these colluding as well as expert judgment basis. The financial crisis also brought about a change in the way the banks were funding themselves. So banks were becoming a little reluctant to lend or borrow on an unsecured basis, and they started preferring secured lending. So the regulatory committees and the global regulators actually wanted that interest rate benchmarks should be founded upon actual transactions. So that was the global push that came, and not on expert judgment, so that it is very reliable, and it is reliable enough for $200 trillion worth of money being actually tagged to something like this. So in 2017, the UK Financial Conduct Authority announced that the underlying markets upon which LIBOR is derived were insufficiently active. So that meant that there were very few actual transactions happening in the underlying markets, and it is not a sustainable interest rate benchmark that is being given. So in relation to so what they stated was that there in there will be no they will no longer compel these panel banks to submit LIBOR data to the rate administrator post 2021. So that was declared in 2017, that there is a clear impetus to stop publishing LIBOR. So what happened? So it is basically in 2020 that the ICE Benchmark Administration announced that 7 tenors of LIBOR, which is the pound, the euro, the Swiss franc, and the yen LIBOR settings for 1 week and two-month tenors have to be seized after December 31st, 2021. And the overnight 1, 3, 6, and 12-month only US dollar LIBORs would cease after 2023 in June. So why was this laid out? So the main impetus behind it was that for the US dollar LIBORs, they did not go for an immediate cessation because there were a lot of money and a lot of contracts being linked to it. So they decided that for stability in the market, they should provide some sort of sort of say a time, or a transition period for consumers, financial institutions, and banks to be able to transition. into the new or the risk-free rates or whichever replacement rates that are coming in. So there are two major questions that come out of this need for transition. So the first question is what will be the alternative rate? So now that LIBOR is going away, and LIBOR, as you see, is applicable for 5 different currencies and so many different tenors, what will be the alternative rate which will be used to replace all the transactions and all the contracts where LIBOR is being used and will be used in future? That is the burning question number one. And the second question is, in case the rate is arrived at, so if someone says that, X rate is being used for LIBOR to be transitioned into, how are firms going to transition into that rate? How do we replace LIBOR with this particular rate? So these two big questions are the ones that we will be discussing as we go on during our webinar.